In the shadowy corridors of the Soviet Union, a figure emerges whose name resonates in the chronicles of the 20th century. Founded in 1922, the Soviet Union did not escape the immutable law that governs the cycles of empires, experiencing rise, glory, and decline. Among the last smoky echoes of a fading era, the figure of the man we will talk about today rises. From the last of the emperors under the banner of the sickle and hammer, deep paradoxes and metamorphoses emanate. Despised in his homeland and revered in the West, he can be seen as the architect of the end of the Cold War, or as the architect of the preludes to contemporary Russia, as the man who liberalized Russia and opened it to the West, or as the one who degraded it from its status as a power, leading it into a spiral of chaos and impoverishment. Mikhail Gorbachev's political life was a balancing act on the tightrope of history. His desires for liberal reforms and preservation of the great Soviet socialist state clashed with tradition and bureaucracy, and with a population that curiously watched as the market became the guiding center of life and culture in all countries. Gorbachev's story is also the story of the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the arrival of the so-called unipolar world order. This is Ronaldo Carrillo speaking. This is the New Encyclopedia. I remind you that you can give us great support to continue doing this work simply by leaving your comments, liking this video, and sharing the material with everyone. All your acquaintances. Below you can also find a link to the Patreon where any collaboration is more than welcome. Without further ado, let's get started. In Privolnoye, a remote rural locality in the south of western Russia, on March 2, 1931, Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev was born. This place, divided between ethnic Russians and Ukrainians, saw his birth into a unique family, a Russian father and a mother of Ukrainian origin. The influence of the Orthodox faith that permeated his home led to a secret baptism, performed by his grandparents who sealed him with the name Mikhail. Gorbachev, of moderate height and premature baldness, bore a port wine stain on his forehead, a distinctive mark that would intrigue those who met him. Gorbachev never let himself be carried away by excesses, and unlike some of his counterparts, Gorbachev maintained a private life, jealously protected and discreet. The beginnings of Mikhail Gorbachev's life are intertwined with the consolidation of power of Joseph Stalin's regime. In that chapter of history where the Soviet leader had initiated a vast process of rural collectivization, at the tender age of 3, young Gorbachev was moved to the new socialist farm that his grandmother had helped to establish in the region. In a twist of fate, Stalin's so-called Great Purge loomed over his family. Both his paternal and maternal grandparents, faithful communists, were sent to the Gulag due to their expressions of support for Leon Trotsky's ideas. After his release, his grandmother shared her difficult experiences in the prisons with him. A few years after this, the Soviet Union ends up allying with the Anglo-Saxon powers to fight against European nationalisms. At the end of the Great Patriotic War, or World War II, with the victory of the Allies, Gorbachev enters school where he would be an avid reader. In the year 1946, when he was just 15 springs old, the young Gorbachev swore loyalty to the banner of communist youth, the so-called Komsomol, a promise that would rise like a comet in his ascending career. Between studies and hard work days on the farm, at the early age of 19 years old, Gorbachev rises as a candidate for formal membership of the Communist Party and also presents his credentials to Moscow State University, the academic jewel of the nation. That young man of peasant origin chooses to study law. Settling into a student dormitory, he faces the mockery of his peers who look down on his strong southern accent and the small-town manners that characterize him. In academic corridors, Gorbachev emerges as a rising leader of the Komsomol, the communist youth. He is put in charge While Gorbachev continues his organizational efforts, he forms debate clubs, promotes sports, and lends his support to the agro-industrial development campaigns driven by Khrushchev. In 1956, he begins his rise in the pyramid of state bureaucracy. The Komitet Gosudarstvenoi Bezopasnosti files have already made a verdict. According to them, he was a man of great political potential and reliable. Gorbachev is promoted to the position of administrative chief in his locality. 2 years later, his reach expands to encompass as administrative chief of the entire region. By March of 1961, Gorbachev rises as a mid-range regional leader, orchestrating the festivities of the global communist youth and overseeing preparations for Politburo members to enjoy their rural retreats. The Politburo of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union was the highest political leadership body in both the Republic of Russia and the other republics that made up the Soviet Union. By 1966, Khrushchev's time finally comes. After his reformist-oriented government, Leonid Brezhnev, a man from the most orthodox and Stalinist wing of the party, now came to power. During his administration, he managed to increase the global influence and military expansion of the Soviet Union and maintained a greater zeal for foreign interference in the economy, although he did not stop making small reforms to attract international trade. He leads a period of stabilization but also of economic stagnation in the face of Western powers that were growing very rapidly. He also allows reformist discussions in the headquarters of the communist youth that would be key to the subsequent rise of Gorbachev. By 1969, Gorbachev manages to be elected as a deputy in the Supreme Soviet of the Soviet Union. This was the highest legislative body of the Soviet Union. Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and the other individual republics had their own Supreme Soviet, but were subordinate to the Greater Supreme Soviet of the Union. Gorbachev is entrusted with the Environmental Protection Commission, and this allows him to travel to East Germany, Bulgaria, and Czechoslovakia, where he witnesses the tank repression of the famous uprisings that occur in these places shortly after Stalin's death. Simultaneously, the Komitet Gosudarstvenoi Bezopasnosti entrusts him with a dark task, leading the punishments to dissidents, a role he fulfills fully, although he would later express alleged charges of conscience. With unquestionable leadership, Gorbachev finds his destiny by joining the Central Committee of the Communist Party. In a scenario where youth was the exception, 39-year-old Gorbachev, a member of the reformist and westernizing wing, was already emerging as an elite member of the party both for his effectiveness and his skill in the art of false flattery towards Brezhnev, a trick that the Komitet Gosudarstvenoi Bezopasnosti did not overlook. Gorbachev becomes a globetrotter of Soviet diplomacy. Between 1970 and 1977, his steps took him through Western lands, Italy, Belgium, Holland, France, and West Germany. This not only leads him to develop key relationships with Western powers, but also to consolidate his internal position in the Soviet regime. In 1978, he receives the momentous appointment of Secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and moves to bustling Moscow with his wife and daughter. At that time, he is appointed Minister of Agriculture. After years of living in shacks, he is finally accommodated in an apartment that did justice to his status in the nomenclature. He is assigned drivers, secretaries, and cooks, but all of them were puppets and silent spies of the Komitet Gosudarstvenoi Bezopasnosti. By 1979, the Soviet Union begins the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, triggering a fierce war of attrition against the Islamic insurgents, later supported by the United States. In addition, Gorbachev fervently supports the repression against the Polish labor movement, and as a reward for his loyalty, in October 1980, the Politburo gives him a seat as a full member, one more step in his ascending career towards the summits of power. While all this is happening, the world witnesses revolutionary changes. For decades in China, in Russia, and in other Soviet republics, open or covert visits from prominent Western financial magnates and diplomats were received. who with juicy proposals pressured for these regions to open up to the growing and increasingly globalized world market. It was a time when the dynamics of market consumption and demand imposed themselves as the guiding principles of life. The international finance industry reached an unprecedented, enormous size. Multinational banks and capital funds increasingly permeated the economies of all countries. Similarly, Western and Anglo-Saxon cultural currents spread throughout the planet. When Brezhnev's last breath fades in 1982 after 18 years of rule, the Soviet throne is inherited by Yuri Andropov, a gaunt old man enslaved by alcohol. In response to this, Gorbachev begins to preside over the Politburo meetings, gaining prominence that aroused concerns in the shadows of the Komitet Gosudarstvenoi Bezopasnosti. Who was really in charge, Gorbachev or Andropov? However, the grim scythe of mortality did not rest. In February of 1984, Yuri Andropov dies of liver cirrhosis, and in his place emerges another weakened old man, chosen by the Politburo for considering Gorbachev as too young. Konstantin Chernenko, another senile and fragile old man. Meanwhile, the struggle between the so-called hardline Stalinist defenders of Soviet greatness and the more or less liberal reformists within the party, inside and outside the country, continued more relevant than ever. Gorbachev continues to cultivate allies during this period, committing himself to Western leaders and weaving a support network for his vision of reforms that made him look good in the West. By 1985, Chernenko dies, and now the Union demanded a new General Secretary of the Central Committee of the party, which was the position that grouped the main powers of the Union. During the transition, Andrei Gromyko, the immutable foreign minister of the Soviet Union, raises his voice in the Central Committee. He strongly recommends Mikhail Gorbachev as the next leader of the Soviet Union. The rest of the Politburo raises their voices in unison support and unanimously crown him as the 8th Soviet leader. Thus, a 53-year-old man ascends to the throne of the second largest power on the planet. Few could foresee that a reformist Leninist with a calm voice, a subtle disdain for the specters of Brezhnev and Stalin, and good friendships on the Western side would take the reins of the Kremlin. Upon coming to power, Gorbachev announces that the Soviet economy was stagnant and that a program of reforms and reorganization was needed. Gorbachev's narrative, the power of Gorbachev, which meant transparency, and Glasnost, which meant openness. The reforms were carried out hesitantly and slowly in the face of a huge bureaucracy that resisted. Initially, in his speeches, he rejected that these reforms were a transition to capitalism. However, he later announced the need for a market economy with limited private enterprise, citing Lenin's famous New Economic Policy, which at the time meant an economic opening in the 1920s. The economic reforms were dedicated to reducing bureaucracy by merging ministries and relegating previously colossal departments to secretariats. His focus was not so much on privatizing, but on decentralizing the state's economic decision-making, reducing ministerial control over the economy, and giving more freedom to state-owned companies and cooperatives. He also advanced an agrarian reform that allowed farms to sell a large part of their harvest directly to stores or cooperatives, and that linked the wages of said farm to their performance. The cooperative law enacted in May of 1988 was perhaps the most significant of these reforms. For the first time since Vladimir Lenin's New Economic Policy, the law allowed private ownership of service companies, the manufacturing industry, and foreign trade sectors. However, during and after this reform program, the economic problems during his administration not only persisted but worsened. The shortage of essential goods increased, the country's debt grew, inflation rose, and purchasing power deteriorated. The results of the economic reforms would be one of his major failures. The concessions of greater business freedom and bureaucratic decentralization and the way they were applied caused greater disorganization in the economy and impoverishment of the population. At the beginning of his term, in his quest to consolidate his reform agenda, Gorbachev did not hesitate to replace old members of the Politburo who could oppose his plans. In total, Gorbachev replaced 14 of the 23 heads of the various departments of the Secretariat, consolidating his dominance in a way that surpassed even Stalin, Khrushchev, or Brezhnev in speed. Gorbachev was no softy when it came to exercising internal power. Gorbachev's iron hand and the influence of his other trusted advisors quickly silenced any dissent among the Soviet nomenclature. Another of the first steps in his reform program was to change the course of Soviet diplomacy by replacing Andrei Gromyko, who had served as foreign minister for 28 years and was not liked in the West for his toughness in diplomatic negotiations. In foreign policy, Gorbachev and his new minister negotiate with the United States the reduction of armaments of both powers and seeks a strategy of détente and pacification with the West, which ends up withdrawing Soviet troops from Afghanistan, holding several historic meetings with Ronald Reagan, and likewise the interest of the Soviet Union in the socialist countries of the Third World is reduced, initiating a predilection for better relations with Western countries such as France, the United Kingdom, and West Germany. It was also the first official meeting in history of a Soviet leader with the Pope. Unlike Brezhnev, who financed any revolutionary potential from anywhere in the world with an interventionist policy, the Soviet leader Gorbachev got tired of dealing with world socialist leaders who came with open hands in search of alms, but without offering practically anything in return, like Hafez al-Assad, Muammar Gaddafi, or Fidel Castro himself. In the second year of Gorbachev's government, the historic Glasnost began to be implemented, which fundamentally sought greater political openness. Greater levels of freedom of opinion and criticism in the media were allowed, as well as religious freedoms. This produces the first public confrontations in many years on various political issues. The radio signals from Voice of America and the British Broadcasting Corporation were now also flooding the Soviet airwaves. Another significant change was in 1989 when the Congress of People's Deputies was created, which would replace the Supreme Soviet and would be elected in multi-party elections for the first time in a long time, thus also taking power away from the party's Politburo and further separating the party from the state. Multi-party elections were held that year, and by the 90s there were already more than 18 political groups in the Congress of People's Deputies. The Communist Party still had a large majority, but with internal factions like the liberal wing. Boris Yeltsin was elected to this Congress by Moscow and would become the leader of the liberal opposition against Gorbachev. A new position was also created, that of President of the Soviet Union, to which Gorbachev was elected that year by a vote of the Congress. The truth is that this political opening would also be the prelude to the political disintegration that the Union was about to experience. In the Congress of People's Deputies, and in the Soviet Union in general, Gorbachev would face on one hand the opposition of Orthodox Soviets who accused him of leading the country into chaos and decay, and of only wanting to please the Westerners at the expense of stability and Soviet sovereignty. And on the other hand, he would face the opposition of liberals who accused him that his reforms were going too slow and that they were of low reach. One of the main critics from the liberal faction was Boris Yeltsin, which led to strong disputes and tensions between both leaders in the following years. Thus, the one-party state was dying. During Glasnost and this political opening, efforts to reinterpret Soviet history were also encouraged, along with the declassification of some secret files. Dozens of political prisoners were released, and more critical opinions could now be read in the press. For the first time in history, an Orthodox Mass was broadcast on state television, and space was given in the public media to the Russian Orthodox Church. Shortly after coming to power on April 26, 1986, The Vladimir Lenin nuclear power plant in Chernobyl becomes the epicenter of the worst nuclear disaster in European history. The explosion of the power plant that plunged Gorbachev into a sea of desperate calls from foreign leaders demanding explanations he didn't know how to give revealed the true fragility of the Soviet system. On the other hand, amidst these circumstances, for some time there had been growing in the member republics of the Soviet Union a nationalist sentiment of seeking independence encouraged by various power groups. Although the dialogues between Soviets and Westerners were better than ever, Gorbachev's political openness gave a boost to these groups seeking to dismember the Union. By 1988, Gorbachev's control over the Baltic republics was crumbling. Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia were calling for decentralization, while Poland was stirring under the leadership of Lech Walesa. In the Caucasus, ethnic and religious conflicts threatened to blow up the region. In East Germany, protests were intensifying, encouraged by a Ronald Reagan who urged Gorbachev to tear down the Berlin Wall. In turn, on the other hand, by 1989, after a costly struggle, with limited resources and a torn and demoralized army, Gorbachev decides the definitive withdrawal from Afghanistan, a painful defeat that shook an army accustomed to victory. This would be the second blow that would lead to the imminent collapse of the Soviet Union. In turn, that same year in Romania, the communist leader Ceausescu was overthrown and executed. Then, after internal and external pressures in Germany, the German socialist authorities finally give in to erase the historical border of the wall and start the process of German reunification. When the Berlin Wall fell, not a few claimed that the Cold War had ended. These same nationalist currents were also running within Russia. August of 1991 marks the sad epitaph of the dying Soviet Union. A year before this, Boris Yeltsin had secured the position of President of the Supreme Soviet of the Soviet Republic of Russia. This was the most important body within Russia as a federative republic, but it was still legally subordinate to the Congress of People's Deputies of the Soviet Union. Heeding the nationalist currents and the reformist and liberal wings, Yeltsin made the Congress and the Supreme Soviet of the Republic of Russia approve a historic declaration of state sovereignty of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic in 1990. This was a first step towards regional independences that affirmed the supremacy of the laws of the Republic of Russia over the laws of the Soviet Union. Shortly thereafter, amidst these struggles, in March of 1991, a referendum is called in the Soviet Union and 78% of the voters vote yes to the continuity of the Soviet Union. But regionalist trends continue to shake the landscape. In his attempt to save the Soviet state, Gorbachev proposes a new agreement to replace the Soviet Union with a confederation of sovereign states. However, in August 1991, high-ranking officials from the Communist Party, the Soviet Union, and the Komitet Gosudarstvenoi Bezopasnosti attempted a coup to prevent the signing of this agreement that formally ended the Union. But a few days later, after political, diplomatic, and armed confrontations, the coup fails. Thanks in large part to the political maneuvers of Yeltsin, who emerged as a bastion of Russian resistance against the coup, also very well supported by United States agents who did everything in their hands to stop the coup. After the failed coup, Yeltsin makes the decision as president of the Russian Soviet to outlaw the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. On August 24th, Gorbachev resigns from the presidency of said party and dissolves the Central Committee. In turn, the Supreme Soviet of the Soviet Union is forced to approve a declaration that transferred powers, ministries, and economic bodies that were previously under the control of the Soviet Union into the hands of Yeltsin as President of Russia. On August 22, 1991, the Supreme Soviet of the Russian Republic declares the historical Russian flag as the national flag of Russia instead of the flag of the Soviet Union. The Russian independence from the Union was de facto beginning. The tide of independence then extends with Ukraine and other 10 republics proclaiming their autonomy in an effort to protect themselves from possible coups and repressions at a regional level. In response to this, Gorbachev refuses to intervene militarily, as would have happened in previous decades, in these republics that were part of the Soviet Union. By December of 1991, the presidents of the Russian Socialist Republic, Ukraine, and Belarus signed the Belavesia Accords, which formally proclaimed the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Gorbachev, who is still president of the Soviet Union, now president of nothing, receives the news by phone. Finally, on December the 25th of 1991, Gorbachev resigns on camera, and the next day, the red flag with the sickle and hammer that had flown for 70 years was replaced by the tricolor of Russia over the battlemented walls of the Kremlin. Gorbachev resigns with these words: "Given the situation created by the formation of the Community of Independent States, I cease my activity as President of the Soviet Union. The line of the country's dismemberment and the state's disunity has been imposed, which I cannot accept. Furthermore, I am convinced that resolutions of such magnitude should have been made based on the express will of the people. Fate would have it that when I found myself at the helm of the state, it was already clear that our country was sick. Today, I am convinced of the historical reason for the changes initiated in 1985. The Soviet era was coming to an end, leaving behind a disintegrated empire, the twilight of an era that faded away in the mists of history. The Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic was now renamed the Russian Federation and thus became its first president. North Atlantic Treaty Organization was rubbing its hands with glee. The Soviet giant teetered on the brink of the precipice without North Atlantic Treaty Organization firing a single bullet. A new international order was inaugurated. The West rewarded Gorbachev with the Nobel Peace Prize in 1990, a prize viewed with suspicion by many Russians. Boris Yeltsin, now president of the Russian Federation, began to reshape the political landscape to his liking, dismissing figures appointed by Gorbachev. When Gorbachev relinquished the reins of power, Russia had ceased to be an empire. The country had lost a quarter of its territory in just 3 years, and the economy was collapsing. The former members of the Komitet Gosударственной Безопасности, later known as the Siloviki, rallied around Boris Yeltsin, forming a power-hungry patronage court. Yeltsin deepened a liberalization process that brought a deterioration in all economic and social indicators and a worsening of Russia's global influence. But this will be a story for another time. The Silovik and former Komitet Gosударственной Безопасности agents around Yeltsin divided up the nation's productive sectors, controlling mines, construction, oil, telecommunications, and defense. Over time, they united with the Orthodox Church, forging a nationalist movement that sought to revive the lost greatness of the Soviet Union and even the Tsarist Empire. Mikhail Gorbachev, once out of the whirlwind of the Kremlin, creates the Gorbachev Foundation based in San Francisco, United States, and joins institutions such as the Club of Rome. He thus becomes a spokesperson for many of the Western globalist and Anglo-Saxon causes and ideas, albeit with certain critical reservations. He was a Soviet communist who later posed for campaigns for Apple and Louis Vuitton. His words were heard on the pages of the New York Times, which granted him a monthly column of global relevance. By 1996, Gorbachev tried to run as a Russian presidential candidate, only to suffer a humiliating defeat that marked his exit from active politics. Gorbachev becomes a relic of a past that no longer had a place in the new Russian order. He later tries, unsuccessfully, to promote social democratic ideas and parties in Russia. With the arrival of Vladimir Putin to power between 1999 and 2008, Gorbachev from his study center sometimes criticizes, sometimes defends Putin. When Putin briefly leaves the presidency of the Russian Federation, Gorbachev approaches him and brings him into the orbit of Barack Obama and Joe Biden, with whom he meets cordially. In the decade following the Cold War, Gorbachev opposes both the North Atlantic Treaty Organization bombing of Yugoslavia in 1999 and the US-led Iraq War. On December 24, 2021, Gorbachev said that the United States became arrogant and self-assured after the collapse of the Soviet Union, which resulted, quote, in a new empire. Hence the idea of North Atlantic Treaty Organization expansion, end quote. At 91 years old, on August 30th, 2022, Mikhail Gorbachev breathes his last breath in Moscow. He was a man who lived during the era of the Soviet Union and the last leader to die after the dissolution of that empire. Thus concludes the life of a disillusioned Leninist with Stalin and his successors, who advocated the viability of socialism until his last days while dining with the most powerful actors of global capitalism. He is acclaimed and criticized for the dismantling of the Soviet Union, a matter that was never publicly in his plans and that was rather considered a humiliation for many Russians. His tragic legacy lies in the political chaos that Russia would experience for several years, in the economic collapse of a country that was already stagnant, and in the manifest inability to dismantle the security apparatus that later swirled around Yeltsin in the 90s to take control of the entire economy of a world power. He was a man who tried to remodel a nation, an empire, and an ideology. The figure of Gorbachev will continue to be the subject of debate and reflection in the study of history. He was a visionary who tried to guide his nation towards a brighter future, or a politician caught in a web of insurmountable dilemmas. He was the last leader of an era, or the first leader of a new one. Thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you liked it, and don't forget that it's very important for us that you can subscribe to the channel, leave your comments, share the video, follow us on our Instagram account called The New Encyclopedia, and above all that you can support us on our Patreon with any help you can give. Thank you all, and God bless.